Hello everyone, my name is Chakra. In this, so far we have seen from my Red Hat and then as well as Microsoft colleagues, you have seen why you should be considering ARO in terms of business perspective, and as well as what's new in OpenShift 4.3 or ARO 4.3. I'll be mostly taking you through the journey of why you should consider ARO from the reasons of technical perspective, and as well as most of your steps in onboarding enterprise applications to ARO. We have seen this already from Ashwani and as well as Edwin on why Kubernetes done right is hard. I would like to highlight the biggest thing why you should consider ARO with respect to security. If you're just getting started with adoption of either Kubernetes or a distribution itself, maybe you're trying out a number of installers that are there in the market. I can say clearly about 50 to 60 different installers, popular installers you have that you want to try and then get the Kubernetes up and running. The problem with this is most of the installers that you have, these are not really checked for security vulnerabilities most of the times. The images that comes along with these installations are untrusted, and then they're not really looked after for vulnerabilities frequently. I wouldn't say it is zero, but it's not a common practice for these installers to look after vulnerabilities. See? And as well as when you are configuring your first Kubernetes cluster, maybe the security rules that you have that comes along with these installers are more designed towards adoption, not really for enterprise usage. And as well as making sure your container platform is ready with respect to OS hardening or platform hardening in terms of planning for your platform upgrades. All these are not really looked after. This is something that you have to invest on your own. Maybe you end up spending 3 months, 4 months just doing this, all these in a controlled fashion, as well as making sure it is right. So all these effort that you put in, you can avoid by leveraging on ARO itself, because ARO itself is hardened by Red Hat and as well as Microsoft for the operations part and Red Hat for the image security and OS security, so that you don't need to spend that 6 months or 4 months time in bringing the container platform to your enterprise. With that, let's look into some of the technical features of ARO itself on why you should pick up ARO versus maybe have your own OpenShift installation that you would like to try on your infrastructure. These are some highlighted ones. We'll go a little bit deeper on each of them, but at the high level, what it would be is making sure you have the same kind of control that you have on an on-prem environment for handling the OpenShift operations. You also have it on the public cloud environment. That is what Microsoft is making sure, giving that features that you require to run the same environments on a public cloud, which gives you much more flexibility, and as well as plugging into the Microsoft ecosystem, the other applications that might be running already there. So let's take a look at each of them in a little bit deeper. Let's start with the starting thing that you look at here is creation of the platform, the Kubernetes or the OpenShift platform itself is as simple as doing AZ arrow create. This, if you have to do it on your own, making sure that it is repeatable, making sure whenever you don't want the capacity that you want, taking it down to minimal size, saving on your subscriptions, saving on your overall support cost. These all things cannot be done if you are going with standalone installation that you typically do on your own. Whereas with AZ with the tight integration with the CLI itself, you can spin up a cluster, pay for what you use, and then destroy that cluster. This is especially useful if you are doing maybe a small POC, or maybe you want to make sure everything is good before you actually do a big upgrade, right? All these cases, there are several scenarios that you can use this CLI tight integration with Azure to be able to spin up clusters on demand and then um, save a subscription cost in terms of spinning up clusters. And making sure the cluster itself is highly available. Typically, if you're doing it on your own, maybe you have a primary cluster and then you have a DR cluster. Most of the times, the DR cluster is unused, and then you are spending subscription cost and as well as infrastructure cost on the DR, although you're not really using them on a day-to-day basis. But you still need to have, because that is a business contingency plan. Whereas with the ARO itself, you are looking at a highly available architecture where your master control plane is spread across 3 different locations or availability zones in terms of in terms of the control plane, and as well as the worker nodes as well. So you don't need to spend time in making sure the platform is highly available. Red Hat and with partnership with Microsoft will take care of that, and the design itself will support you in that case. This is typically hard to implement if you're doing it on your own, as in you need to make sure the latencies between the masters are correct. The latencies between your worker nodes and masters are correct. There are several nuances on how much latency is allowed, without which the control plane goes into a confused mode, right? So a lot of things you can avoid just by using ARO and not spend time in investigating how to make it perfect. And as well as some of the other concerns with respect to financial institutions are, how do I make sure the default cluster that is provisioned on a public cloud is safe, and it's not really, I'm not leaving out entry points like maybe exposing the API server outside to internet, which is typical in case of if you see any distribution of Kubernetes. By default, the API server is exposed outside. This has been heard by Microsoft and Red Hat, and then it was made sure that you have a choice whether you want to expose it outside or keep everything internal, everything private, and also make sure your workloads are able to talk to other workloads in the same VNet. You can deploy OpenShift or peer with the other virtual networks that you already have. So you can fully leverage the express routes and as well as the pairing, VNet pairing, and making sure your OpenShift itself is running on a existing VNet instead of creating a brand new VNet, which typically happens when you go with a 3.11 based installation. Whereas in 4.3, you can go with a existing VNet as well. So these are some of the things, the small things, but pretty useful for customers like financial institutions, who are very much careful about how the cluster is exposed outside and what are the entry gates into the cluster. And the other thing, if you look at from the when there is a platform as when it is a managed service itself, most of the times the things that you can do on these managed services are less. That is typically the case before, as in you cannot run privileged containers, you cannot change the configuration, because these things will affect the overall operations. And then if there is no right collaboration between the customer and as well as the operations team who is managing them, you might end up in situations where you have performed some upgrade and then upgrade fails because there's someone who changed something manually. This won't be the case anymore to a large extent, because you get full control of you get full control on the cluster, so you can perform cluster admin level operations, but also not compromise on the upgrade process. How it is achieved is OpenShift 4.3 or ARO 4.3 is mostly configurable from the UI, so you don't need to go to the host to do any configuration. And most of the configurations are taken care by the operator framework that is built into OpenShift itself to ensure that whatever configurations that you make are won't break the upgrade process. So this operator framework itself has given a lot of flexibility for operators to change everything from the UI, whether it is a node configuration, whether it is a master configuration, all of those things can be done by UI itself. You don't need to go into a node and then change the configuration. It's like a no-touch environment. Everything can be done from the UI. So this gives you a greater flexibility on what you can do on the platform, and as well as flexibility for operations to be able to perform upgrades or patches or maintenance activities whenever they want. And also, I've seen customers spending a lot of time, months' time in making sure the platform that you installed just now is compliant with all the security compliances that industry typically needs. You run your security scans and make sure the scan results, you look at them, you inspect them, make configuration changes, and then spend a lot of time in making sure the cluster is hardened. Whereas with ARO itself, you can avoid that all that time, spending that time, and just pick up the ARO, which is already certified with the various things that you have seen that you see on the slide here. So you can definitely save a lot of time when during the adoption phase. This is like a no-brainer, especially for enterprises who are serious about security. I think this is just this is very easy for them to adopt instead of worrying about hardening the platform itself. And also, there are several other integrations with Azure itself, as in maybe you have a Azure Active Directory on the cloud, or your own AD that you have on-prem. Most of the times, there will be things on-prem, there will be things on the cloud. It cannot be like only cloud. It cannot be like only on-prem nowadays, right? So in order for you to seamlessly integrate the authentication systems or other connectivity, these are already provided by ARO, so that you can leverage either on-prem AD or a cloud AD and connect it as a authentication source for your platform. So you have a single way of accessing OpenShift rather than have two different sources of truth for your authentication. And also in terms of the subscription cost, and as well as making sure you scale on demand, it's easy as running few commands to be able to scale your nodes rather than pre-plan for your peak requirement and then spend more than what is required. So you can scale whenever you need. So you can start small or the minimal and then scale on demand, rather than plan for the peak and then starting to realize, should I take them out or should I not take them out, because once I installed, maybe it is very static environment. Whereas in ARO, it is a dynamic environment. You can scale up and down whenever you need. So these are some key considerations that why you should pick ARO versus having your own installation when you're just getting started with the adoption of a container platform like ARO. Let's look into some of the application portions of the onboarding process. Typically, when I speak to customers, customers are, if they're just getting started with Kubernetes or OpenShift in general, they might see a lot of options out there. Kubernetes in general has so many choices, it's sometimes overwhelming, as in you don't know which one to pick, right? Unless you are in that stream for 5 or 6 years, or like maybe it's from the beginning of Kubernetes itself, you don't know what is the best tool for this one. So what I've seen is typically you try things, see which one is good, which one is not good. So you end up spending a lot of time in trying out things. Whereas in ARO itself, it's a curated list. So if you look at in terms of what tools should I pick for monitoring? So for monitoring, it's Prometheus. What tool should I use for my image supply chain? It is your S2I, right? So you have a very opinionated way, of doing things. You can go you can cross that opinionated way of doing things, but if you're a person, or if you're an organization who just wants someone to tell you, okay, I should do image build, this is how I should do image tagging, or this is how I should promote, right, without worrying about all the other options that you have, you just want to get things done, maybe this is the right option for you, which you can pick up right away and then start developing value rather than spend time in investigating which is the best method. So this is where I see the value of ARO, where you have a opinionated way of doing things, whether it is image supply chain, whether it is scanning, whether it is promoting to production. All these things are some things that you learn over a period, typically in a Kubernetes adoption phase, whereas in ARO, you have a very opinionated way like that. And then you might be at different stage, right? Maybe you have a POC and then you want to move to next phase. Maybe you are just getting started with containers, or maybe you are in a phase where you're already working on some of the on-prem Kubernetes distribution, and then you want to accelerate that adoption. So depending on the type of phase that you are, ARO provides different starting points for you. So when I say it is opinionated, you have a option to go with the opinionated way, but I see I've been in the OpenShift industry and as well as Kubernetes industry for a very long time. The design itself supports you for flexibility, but there is always a choice for you to go in a very opinionated way. So what happens in typically, let's say you are in a phase where you are on Kubernetes already on-prem, and then you want to move to ARO. The things that you might want to look at when you are migrating to, or when you are moving to ARO for onboarding is the pod security policies or the security contexts are slightly rigid on OpenShift compared to a Kubernetes distribution, because, like I said, Kubernetes is designed for adoption, not really ready out of the box for production usage. Then you might need to work on some ensuring some policies are in place. Sorry. You might need to work on some policies that you need to put in place for the workload to run on OpenShift. And also, you also might need to do some refactoring of the Docker images, because when you're running on Kubernetes, the security rules for running containers with non-root are slightly flexible, whereas when you move to ARO, these are not the same. So you might need to do some small refactoring of the images. So like I said, it's not like cut and paste. There is something you need to do, which is reality. Of course, there are some workloads which can just cut and paste, but there are some workloads you still need to do some amount of refactoring, which is good for you in terms of security. That is why you need to do. It's not because you want to use ARO. It is good for your application. That is why you need to do. You can relax security and then just get started right away. But my suggestion would be do it in the right way. Maybe in another phase, you are in a VM and then you want to move to ARO. You are looking at a very basic phase where you want to see, how do I start with the image build process? What are the trusted sources for my images, right? How do I make sure these applications are running as non-root containers? For all these, there is a recommended way from Red Hat, from Microsoft, as in to choose what base images to choose. How do you ensure when there is a base image update, your application image also gets updated, which is a big deal in most of the enterprises, because as security is a very core prominent feature in the whole image supply chain, how do you make sure your application images won't break when there is a change in the base image? How do you ensure, how do you notify when there is an image change in the base and then you want to apply it in the application image? These are some small things that you you might need to consider, but these are required things in case of enterprises that you cannot avoid. So doing this requires, like I said, a lot of time that you spend in basically figuring out what is the best way. But whereas in ARO, it is already a recommended way to do that. The other things you might need to look at when onboarding applications is maybe your services are using some system D services. Maybe they are using some kind of host level features. Maybe some special drivers that those are there. When you're moving to a ARO kind of environment, you need to also look into those kind of things. Some of the host level features, how you can move them to your ARO platform itself. So these are some things I observed when you are moving to ARO. You need to keep in mind. Particularly, I would like to stress on the image supply chain, as in the phases where during part of my consulting, the phases where you need to for the image build process itself is how do you ensure the notification of base image changes to the upstream images is to also look at some of the things like how do I use a major version, how do I use a minor version, right? Because the base image itself might have some breaking changes, and then how do I ensure what are the methods that I can follow to make sure I'm not breaking my application image. So these are some of the critical things that you need to keep in mind in order to ensure your image supply chain is solid. It can be a security patch as well, where the base image got a very big security patch, and then how do you make sure that base image may be used by 100 different applications? These 100 different applications, how do you propagate that update, right? And then without having to spend another 3 months into the patching process, how do you quickly ensure that your latest security patches are there in all the images? So these are some of the nuances that we need to keep in mind, which are very well practiced in the ARO. The application packaging itself, so I have seen this with many customers, like, okay, when I start with OpenShift or the distribution of Kubernetes like ARO, am I tying in too tightly with the platform, right? Like, am I using only OpenShift features so that I don't have an exit when I make a call? Like, I don't want to use OpenShift and then I want to go with something else. My recommendation is, if you have something that platform provides, use it. As I see, based on the experience, the exit strategy is not a big effort, because most of the packaging systems that you see can be converted from one form to another very easily. I would rather leverage the features and then fasten the value rather than spend time in deciding whether I should use Helm charts or whether I should use OpenShift templates. So this is some typical questions that will come up whenever you start onboarding your applications. There is a very valid reason on why you don't want to tie into one particular thing, but also, like I said, the exit strategy is not that hard. And then use as much as the platform features so that you can fasten the value to the market. And the promotion process itself is another big thing where you will end up in choosing the CI/CD tool itself. Like, how do I promote my application? Should I use a Jenkins, which is our external Jenkins, or should I leverage something which is part of the OpenShift? Again, my recommendation, either you use Azure DevOps or some kind of inbuilt CI/CD for OpenShift, rather than spend time on something, some other external tool which is not really built for container native technologies. It might be built for a traditional VM-based applications, but there is a larger community that is building up in terms of cloud native CI/CD tools like Azure DevOps, and as well as the Tekton built into OpenShift. I would spend time on those rather than trying to figure out how to make Jenkins work with OpenShift, right? This is my opinion when onboarding applications to ARO. And then also the monitoring and logging and the storage, right? These are something that need to be in my opinion, outside the cluster, so that you are able to monitor your cluster and then collect all the logs. So even if your cluster goes down, and then you still have your logs out there, and then also you still have your persistent storage outside the cluster. So keep the cluster as much as stateless as possible, so that even if the upgrade fails or even if the complete cluster goes down momentarily, you still can recover because your state is outside. So as you know, the stateless applications are easy to recover, right? So keep your Kubernetes cluster as much stateless as possible. These are some of the things I would consider when you are onboarding applications onto ARO itself. But there are several other small things that you might need to look into when you're migrating to ARO. If you need any assistance in onboarding applications onto OpenShift, Azure Red Hat OpenShift 4.3, you can definitely reach out to us. There is a free half-day assessment that we can help you with for moving fast in your adoption phase.